Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave who later became an African American abolitionist. Frederick Douglass was also an individual that made it his responsibility to break the hindering chains of slavery and replace them with rights. Douglass was born in 1818 as a slave. He lived in Talbot County, Maryland. 6 years later, in 1824, he moved to a plantation on the Wye River. Soon after this move, his mother died, leaving him and his 3 siblings to fend for themselves. As a result of his mother's death, he and his 3 siblings were sent to Baltimore. In Douglass's case, Baltimore is a very significant place because this is where he learns to write and read. Douglass is also assigned to his first job as an assistant on a shipyard. While in Baltimore, he continues to practice his literacy skills, although his master doesn't like this. His master, Thomas Auld, believes that slaves learning to read makes them more rebellious. So, he stops Douglass from teaching all other slaves to read and write. However, this does not stop Douglass. Frederick Douglass forms Bible studies. Bible studies were their code names. These Bible studies were places where Frederick Douglass taught slaves to read and write. Douglass knew that his master would not like this, so he planned to escape. However, his escape plan was foiled, and he was sent right back to the shipyard. 2 years later, in 1838, Frederick Douglass borrowed a free black sailor's papers, and he escaped to New York. New York is where he learned of William Garrison. Douglass made a subscription to Abolition Weekly, and this is where he got his inspiration. In 1841, Douglass was convinced by William C. Coffin to speak on his life. Frederick Douglass is influenced by this, and he decides to speak. After Douglass is speaking, William Garrison gives a speech. After this meeting, Garrison and his friends develop a close interest in Douglass and decide that Douglass should be in their society. Later, in 1843, in Pendleton, Indiana, Frederick Douglass was beaten and broke his hand, and he never recovers from this hand being broken. 4 years after his hand was broken, he published his narrative. The significance of his narrative was very high because it could cause him to go to jail. This was because Frederick was indeed a fugitive slave. Soon after the release of his book, he met Susan B. Anthony and became a champion of women's rights. He also participated in Seneca Falls. Perhaps the most important part of Douglass's legacy was when he toured Great Britain and Ireland. In Great Britain and Ireland, he gave many lectures and was able to raise enough money to purchase his freedom. So, in 1847, he returned to New York and purchased his freedom and bought a printing press. This is where he printed his famous article, The North Star. After publishing this, it became a weekly thing that appeared in the Abolitionist Weekly. As Douglass's word began to get out, he met John Brown. John Brown informed him of many slaves that were traveling north in the Underground Railroad. This influenced Douglass to shelter these slaves that were coming up north. His decision to shelter these slaves changed many of his political views. Later, he merges the North Star articles with Gerrit Smith's Liberty Papers. This causes a major rift between Douglass and Garrison. This political rift causes them to go their separate ways. Although this rift did not stop Douglass from